Welcome to the Village Well podcast, brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee in downtown Culver City.
Welcome back to the Village Well podcast. My name is Toby. I'm a bookseller here at Village Well. And with me today are two participants of the original book club this month.
Andy.
And Omari.
And this week we read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. This book is a dystopian sci-fi novel that was written in the early 90s by Octavia Butler. If you haven't heard of Octavia Butler, she is an African-American sci-fi writer who wrote most of her work between the late 70s and early 2000s. She's an LA local. She was born and raised in Pasadena, and I think later on spent some time in Seattle. And this is part one of what turned out to be a duology. The sequel is Parable of the Talents. It came out 5 years later. And today it's often credited as being particularly prophetic. The novel takes place in eerily the 2020s in LA in California. And for example, we all had the strange sensation of reading a novel that is specifically explicitly dated. There's journal entries that are dated on the day that I've read the book. I sat there on March 9th, I think, and read a journal entry by the protagonist dated March 9th, 2025. We live in a post-apocalyptic dystopian world in the United States. The protagonist is Lauren Olamina. She lives in a small kind of walled community in what used to be the suburbs, in what I believe is a fictionalized version of Pasadena. It's what's called Robledo. And they're holding out and kind of trying to keep the anarchy and the chaos at bay. They're not extremely well off, but they're trying to maintain the little bit of privilege and security they have as opposed to people who are roaming the streets. Addiction is rampant. This world is also marked by climate disaster. The sea levels have risen. There's a general breakdown of the public sector, of public safety, the regulatory state. Wealth inequality has escalated. Also, we see there's a return of something like indentured servitude or even out-and-out slavery. So Lauren is a teenager. At the beginning, she is about maybe 15, and then later on, by the end of the book, she's 18. She is the minister's daughter in this little walled community in Robledo. The form of the novel is entirely in journal entries by Lauren. So we know this world through reading her journal. Many of the details about what kind of political system there is, the nature of this kind of slow-moving apocalypse is unclear to us because we are stuck in her perspective. And about a third into the novel, something happens that we'll get to talk about a bit later. And Lauren starts a voyage through the state of California, is forced to start a voyage through the state of California, by the end of which the novel ends and they arrive somewhere. And that is the end of this. That is the end of Parable of the Sower. So we had a great discussion about this novel. I was really blown away by all the different impressions, all the different readings, and kind of what elicited the reading in all these different readers. I think we opened the discussion with me asking, what is one word that would describe your reading experience of this novel?
Yeah, and to me, I came into the conversation feeling that the book was hopeful.
Yeah, I would say disconcerting.
Yeah, I think we kind of had a lot of people on the train of that was really challenging and dark and
bleak.
Depressing, bleak. Yeah. And then whereas I felt a lot more hopeful about the book and about Lauren's perspective in particular.
I definitely coming in would have leaned more like in the dark and kind of, disconcerting, world, but also like fascinating and thought-provoking. But when you said hopeful, I immediately started thinking about the book differently. And I was like, there is a lot of hope in it because the character, while a realist, is hopeful, right? So I thought that was like that immediately got my mind going and like started changing the way I thought of the novel.
We should probably talk a little bit more about the protagonist and what she's like, what makes her special. And so one of the things is she is mature beyond her years, and part of her journaling and part of her character is that she came up with this new faith, this new kind of religion or new creed that she calls Earthseed. Mm-hmm. And that is also, I think, where the hopeful element comes in. That is something that she writes, kind of being the Baptist minister's daughter. She has kind of a natural, I guess, competence or natural, proclivity towards the spiritual, towards religion.
Yeah.
And she makes up these verses in Earthseed that read a bit like poetry. They read a bit like Buddhist, maybe even koans, Buddhist philosophy. And I think that's where a lot of the hopefulness comes in.
I think also another like side of the hopefulness to me was just like, I guess thinking on the zooming out and like Octavia Butler's perspective, like writing it. And especially towards the beginning when Lauren's living in this community with like her neighbors basically, and the way that they are surviving. I don't know, I felt like to me it outlined a lot of skills that would be useful come the apocalypse. So it was cool. I thought I was like, oh, this is like almost a guide on things to learn, things to do. And that was one of the things we talked about in book club too. Like, what were some skills that we either had or would like to learn for
survival skills
for the end days.
Yeah. I think with Earthseed, it's such a rich part of the text. I mean, it starts, I think, every chapter with some verse from her, what she describes as like her discovery of Earthseed. Other characters describe as her creating Earthseed.
Whenever somebody accuses her of making it up, she insists that she only found it. It's true. It's truths that she has come across and found.
Yeah, and so it is sort of the spine of the novel, and it really is like where you can put so much into it. Whether, one of the things that we talked about that, really resonated with me was like Earthseed, according to Lauren, is destined to live amongst the stars, right? That's sort of like a core tenet of Earthseed for her. And like, what does that mean? Does that mean that she's giving up on Earth and she feels like Earth is, a lost cause? Some people in the group definitely felt that way. Mm-hmm. and I think a lot of those people would describe the novel as dark and depressing. Others, and I know this is the camp I fell into, is more like Lauren views Earthseed as a way of rebuilding society, as a way of saying if we come together and we believe in something and we have an aspiration, that we can build a community that can go to the stars. And that is much more hopeful. It's much more forward facing. And so, in the version of the book that I purchased, like there's an intro from LeVar Burton who talks about all of these things and how Earthseed is like almost the way he views the world now. And so, I think that is such it's such a valuable thing to think about how you interpret Earthseed, because it really is reflective of yourself. So I think it's a fascinating part of the novel that as you read it, depending on the world you live in and your mindset towards it, I think it'll change.
Yeah, it's very much, I mean, the focus is on change. It turns change almost into a god, into a non-interventionist, but into a godly being, right? So change is God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but she also talks about shaping God, and even though God is change, which is a very complicated thought to wrap my mind around.
Yeah, it's definitely circular, but it's also, I think it's like empowering, and that was part of the hope I got from it too. It was like the idea that yes, like things happen to you, but you can also make things happen in turn, right. And there's like a balance almost to it.
It's like this constant tension or balance between acceptance and agency.
Yes.
Right? Acceptance of things. And I thought about this a bit more since the book club. This really goes through the plot in a lot of different ways. When we talk about the tension between building or rebuilding civilization, building community, but also the survival mode that includes being paranoid, safety, security. At the beginning, when they're in the walled community, the walls as a necessity to keep, those who want to harm the community at bay and keep them outside, versus this kind of ethos of empathy and of inclusion of community building. Right? There's always kind of this tension that goes through like a red thread through the entire novel. I think between killing and loving or surviving and building anew. What's something else that's on your mind or something that you thought of after the fact, after the book club?
Yeah, well, I think to me, one thing that I felt like got to the core of our discussion about Earthseed, I feel like we were sort of getting into Earthseed as a religion versus a philosophy, which isn't really something you can answer in book club in an hour and a half. But yeah, we were there were some people I think who felt like a little off-put or like alienated by, the terminology of like using God and heaven, versus like kind of more buying into how Lauren describes it, which is more of like a philosophy or like I've just observed these things. Like it's just a way of life or a way of living more than a worship of a certain being. So there was like this interesting discussion around the table between those two kind of different sides.
I mean, it goes back to the structuring tension between kind of the dystopian elements, and then this is the utopian element. This is like the creating something new. And I think we should be clear, this is a very violent book. There's as part of this lawless dystopian future, there's a lot of raping and killing happening, and kids get harmed. There's these. I thought there's these. I think we call them. Somebody called them zombie-like.
Yeah.
There are these. This group of addicts who are addicted to a new substance called pyro, and so they get high and then become pyromaniacs because it's apparently an ecstatic experience to watch things burn while high on this drug. And so they're very, very dehumanized in kind of a troubling way. It's almost these verses about change and God and acceptance are kind of the balance out this very violent and bleak reality they live in. Oh, I'm getting a clue from our producer that we can spoil the rest of the plot at this point. Did you guys have anything to talk about now that we're in the spoiler section? Everything is fair game.
The first third of the book, we're in this walled community, right? And at least for me, like it's pretty easy to like kind of, not fall in love with the family, the Lawrence family, but like understand her love for her family, which is complicated. By varying family dynamics. So for them to, be just killed off, the movie equivalent of being killed off screen. And it's like, oh, okay, so this is how this world works. And this is how Octavia Butler is shaping it. That was, I thought, very smart. And it forced this character who had always had family, who had always had a community, to build her own for the first time. And that's what she does on the road. And so it's like, it really was the perfect setup for this, essentially what transitioned into this travel story. But it was definitely jarring and shocking. And I was expecting a much more traditional sort of reveal of like, oh no, they did survive and we're all okay. And we're going on the road together. But it's like, no, they're gone.
Yeah, I think what was also interesting about that is that she doesn't even witness any of her family's deaths. Her father dies like a year or two before the rest of her family does, and they never find his body. No. And it's so the family's kind of left in limbo for a while, kind of knowing he's dead, but also hoping.
Yeah, there's no closure.
They have to just kind of roll with it.
Unlike her brother, whose name I'm forgetting, Keith. Yes,
About Keith.
That's also you talk about how violent the book is, and it's just like Keith. He's a rebel. He wants to leave the community and see what the world is really like and be a man and like be on his own. And he ends up dying probably the most grisly death I've ever heard of. Or
but only hear about it secondhand also.
Right. And it's like probably third hand, right? Because it's like Lauren's parents go and see the body and it's described to them and then they describe it, or she kind of overhears it. Mm-hmm. So it's like, but it's horrifying, and it's like something that is clearly like haunting Lauren throughout the rest of the story as she encounters more of these pyro fueled.
Yeah, we get the sense he runs away and like joins a kind of one of these drug dealing gangs.
Yeah, he's also only 14 years old.
Yeah, he's a kid,
and with someone the family was always kind of wary of, because he was always very interested in getting his hands on a gun before it was, they start like training around firearms when they're, like 15, I think, in this community. And he's incredibly impatient until, he finally sneaks out and kind of.
But I also want to kind of mention that all these extremely violent incidents and this violence, it never feels gratuitous, because there's no drawn out sequences where we see descriptions of this kind of violence. A lot of times it happens off screen, or it happens very quickly and in very kind of short, brief language without much description.
Well, I think another thing about kind of Lauren as a character and also her relationship with her family is that she had always planned to leave and kind of set out on her own and go north. Originally, she's going to go with her boyfriend at the time, and that doesn't end up, going to plan. But, once her father dies, it was an interesting sort of challenge to her Earthseed belief system, because it's, her father dies, there's this big change that happens, and she kind of sets back her plans of leaving so that she can help care for her family.
Mm-hmm. I think the last element of this spoiler section that I think is important, for me at least, is like her hyper empathy. So this is like a big part of the character, but again, it's very matter of fact in the way that it's described. But essentially, any violence that she witnesses or any emotions that she witnesses, she basically feels. And so if someone is extremely sad and crying, she starts to feel that. Her brothers used to like pretend to be bleeding, and she would start to bleed in response. And then later in the book, when they're on the road, they have to commit these horrible acts of violence to defend themselves. She feels every single act of violence she inflicts on another. And so like that factor is like, again, it's like the earth seed of it all is very tied into this ability to feel what everyone else is feeling all of the time.
It's not just pain, it's also pleasure. When she has an affair, a love affair, that is kind of enhanced as well. Like the physical intimacy is enhanced. But I thought it was also very interesting to think about, to what extent is that a handicap or disability in a way, and to what extent does this make her more vulnerable, and to what extent is this actually in this world kind of a special power almost?
I think a lot of people agree that it is a vulnerability at the very least, but in terms of if it makes her a better like leader or prophet or whatever.
And Messiah. Somebody said Messiah, which was great.
Yeah, someone did say Messiah, and kind of what that means, or also a martyr, because she's taking on other people's pain.
Very Jesus-like was, I think, what part?
Jesus-y.
Jesus-y, I think, was the phrase.
And so that kind of adds another element of like being extra vulnerable in this world, but extra connected to everyone also.
I think for me, it was really like, it's a disadvantage for her. It's a handicap for her, because she can just be taken out of any situation by a sudden wave of massive emotion or physical pain or pleasure. But it's probably an advantage to the world she wants to create, because she wants to create a more empathetic world, because that's the world she exists in.
It's an incentive to create that world, because she cannot live in this dog eat dog survival of the fittest world that is full of just pain and violence. Like, she has a visceral, like a physical need to create a safer and better world in a way.
Yeah. And also important is that she learns later on that she's not the only one who has this sort of ability. It's often caused in people if their parents were on one of the certain drugs, fictional drugs in this world, while they were pregnant, basically, that causes this syndrome in their children. So she meets a few others like her, and they eventually form part of her community, her new community.
Yeah. And she also discovers, and we discover through her, that people who have this hyper empathy are being targeted by these sort of, technocrats that are starting to take over parts of California and presumably the rest of the country.
Yeah, these corporations, right?
Yeah, these giant corporations. And they're targeting people with this hyper empathy for essentially like slave labor, I guess. I don't fully remember the context around that, but it is like a major part of this story of like, these are people who are sought after by these companies who are really trying to, take advantage of them.
Yeah, they're easy to control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet for Lauren, this is her superpower, and it is, I think, for her a positive, and all these things we're talking about with her seeds. So it's like, again, it's like Octavia Butler is just really showing like all the different sides of a situation, and like how complex and how like your exact situation determines what is an advantage versus a handicap.
Yeah. So this book has definitely had a moment. It's been being praised for being so prophetic, and I also wanted to kind of pitch the sequel, because I think a lot of the politics are more fleshed out in the sequel. We have a president who already appears here, President Donner, and we just kind of get glimpses of what he's about. In the sequel, he really emerges as this more Trump-like figure. But already here, why does this resonate so much today?
In this world that Octavia Butler has created, there are, like, America and the government in general is pretty much broken down. It still is holding on to a certain extent, but you essentially have these hyper-rich plus these corporations who are existing above the mayhem and taking advantage of the people who are trying to just survive it. And then you have everyone else who is really in the muck with the people on drugs, the mass homelessness, the fires, which obviously here in LA is very resonant. I know that there's a sequence that I think takes place in February or January of like 2025 in the book, where there's a giant fire. So it's like very resonant. And I think that you could say that the same thing is true of America, that America is basically based on the idea that there are people who have come here to make as much money as possible and, absolutely take advantage of anybody who gets in their way, and use whoever they need to use in order to do that. And I think that you could say that that's been America from the beginning, and Octavia Butler really tapped into that and then said, what happens if these tech companies in the .com bubble in 1993, when she wrote the book, just take over? And like, that's essentially where we are now, right? Like, the world's richest man is in, the White House, like destroying or making efficient, government organizations and government departments, and like, but he owns a giant tech company and a giant car company that's tech based, et cetera. So I think that, you look at these things and it's like, it's prescient both in terms of understanding how America existed and still continues to exist, but also in like the specifics of this like tech sector and like this tech takeover.
I think something that I really appreciated was that Octavia Butler also brings in a lot of, historical background. Like she kind of just sprinkles it in, especially when she talks about at one point there is some company that completely buys out a city and turns it into
a company town.
A company town, yes. And a lot of people from her community at that point are debating and then decide to move there for the security. There's all these armed guards. They think this is a better place for them. But Lauren and her father discuss how these aren't the first company towns and how there have been documented cases of those company towns basically screwing over their residents, making it so that they're more and more in debt until they're basically indentured servants. And that's kind of part of the landscape that's becoming more common in this world. So I really appreciated that. And yeah, I think we also talked about just the fires was pretty unsettling to read about, like fires in Southern California as, it just happened here.
Well, there's a sequence in the book where like they're walking, I think in like a canyon essentially, and a fire starts behind them and starts to essentially outrun them because they're on foot. They're not in a vehicle. And they survived this, but only because of luck, not because of, their quick feet. Like they would have died. And it is, especially living, on the west side. I remember, in January, I could see the flames from my window and like, that and we've all seen the video of like the cars being bulldozed out of the way because people just had to run for their lives. Like that was like that was probably the scariest moment of the book for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I actually feel like that was the most visceral part of the book, like in terms of, violence and destruction. Like I felt like a lot of it, as we were saying, was very kind of cut and dry or like, just stated. The fire itself was like described in pretty, I don't know, not gory, but visceral detail.
Yeah.
And which I thought was interesting just as like Octavia Butler's ethos, like the destruction and of the environment and the power of environmental disaster was something that was clearly at the forefront of her. Yeah.
But there's also this makes me think of the pyros, these addicts, this group of addicts who basically worship fire. Right, and then she creates this ethos that worships change and has a very different kind of, much more community focused. And it's like the ultimate kind of fatalistic, nihilist endeavor: get high and start worshiping destruction. I also thought in terms of the fire, I found interesting. So all these services don't really work here anymore, or they're explicitly described as for pay. They cannot afford to call the firefighters at some point. They cannot afford to call the police and pay the fees because they're corrupt and they charge these exorbitant fees. And that also brought me back to I think somebody brought this up in the book club too, how in the Palisades, how some of the buildings got special protection because they had these expensive private, like kind of legion of firefighters, whereas a lot of the more broad, like forest fires and the general firefighting was being done by prisoners, right? By these like firefighting programs in federal prisons. And so that's fairly, I don't know, I feel like we're already one step into the dystopia of this novel in that sense.
Just one?
Yeah, and we've seen that Elon Musk is now trying to build his own company town, Snailbrook, in the Austin suburbs. So, I think there's definitely lines that we could draw, pretty direct lines to, some of the setting of the book and our current reality.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the ever-present homelessness. They, many of the people in the group when they on the road want to go find work for money because most work is not for money; it's for barter, for housing, etc. Things like that. That's obviously an extreme version of our reality, but
inflation.
Yeah, hyperinflation. Food, $1,000 basically is nothing at this point. It's like finding a $10 bill on the street. It's all of those things felt very like if we took 2025 in reality and we put it up to 11, what would it be? And it's kind of this book. We're not quite there yet, but just like Octavia Butler said in interviews, she basically like, how are you so prescient? Well, I looked at our current world and I said, what happens if this moves forward unchecked for 30 years? And this was the result that she got. And that's probably, it feels that like she was maybe 30 years early, but like, this doesn't feel like it's that far off in the future, which is like probably the most horrifying thing about reading the book.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I don't know. I really enjoyed my experience reading this book. I enjoyed our discussion at book club. It was only the second meeting I'd ever been to. So I was really excited that it went so well and excited for future meetings to come for sure.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the book. As horrifying as I found some of it to be, I did like, it was a nice like, Black Mirror. I'm really looking forward to reading the sequel, which I bought when I was here for book club. This was my first book club meeting ever, not just here. And I really enjoyed the conversation. It was very enlightening. And, like I said, like right at the beginning, you said that it was a hopeful book. And I was like, oh, now I have to rethink everything. So it was really great.
Yeah, it's a book that gives hope in very dark times. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Omari and Andy, for a great conversation. And if you want to join us at our next original book club, it'll be April 15th at 6:30, and we're reading Samantha Harvey's Orbital, last year's Booker Prize winner. And we hope to see you there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
If you'd like more information from us, check out the show notes or send us an email at podcast@villagewell.com. You can always order the books mentioned through our website. This episode of the Village Well podcast is brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee. It was produced and edited by Josh Stretton Carlson, and our theme music is from Noah Vickland. See you next week, and keep reading.